Any general advice that you would have in mind for people exploring the domain or just starting?
I think one thing I would tell young people is don't jump for money, jump for role or growth. Because your initial years is when you're actually adding value, right? And try to learn as much as you can from the role. So don't limit it like, okay, I am so-and-so, this is my start, this is my end, right? Try and learn, go and talk to people in your organization, learn as much as you can about that business. That's what really builds your career as you go further and further.
All right, perfect. So with that, let me invite our guest for today, Krithika. Could you please turn on your video and mic? Let's see.
Hi, Akash.
Hey, hi, Krithika. Thank you so much for joining us today. So
My pleasure.
for everybody who's on the call today, I'll give you a quick background about Krithika. We're really excited to be hosting her. So Krithika is currently the Chief Data Science Officer at Scripbox. And as you might already know, Scripbox is one of India's largest wealth management platforms. And I personally have been a happy user of Scriptbox for many years. In fact, that's the first tool that I used when I bought a mutual fund for the first time. And data science is used extensively at Scriptbox to offer a personalized experience, to offer recommendation, offer analyses of your investments. And as the Chief Data Science Officer at Scriptbox, I'm sure Krithika has a lot of interesting insights to share about how data is used in this domain. But before this, Krithika was also the founder and CEO of Set My Test, an online testing tool for teachers. And before that, Krithika was the founder at New Rubric Solutions, a data analytics platform that can capture student performance in academics and in life skills. So a lot of interesting work over the years, and we'll get to talk about that as well. And before that, Krithika was director, head of marketing intelligence at Fidelity Investments, and a principal and consulting leader at Infosys Consulting, focused on Asia and Europe. And Krithika holds a PGDM from IIM Calcutta and is in mechanical engineering from Anna University. So welcome once again, Krithika, and really excited to be hosting you today. And you've had an amazing career spanning a whole bunch of different domains and roles. And we'll try and touch on all of them in whatever time we have. But to begin, I would love to maybe just understand your journey from Infosys Consulting to Set My Test. What went into it, and how did you go through the various stages of this journey?
Sure. Thanks, Akash, for having me. I'm very excited to see the questions that are coming up on the chat. And I'm very glad that you're a Scriptbox user and a happy one. So most of our customers are very loyal and we're very proud of that. And thank you for mentioning that. We really like that. Was a great way to start. I'll try and keep my journey a little short so we can get to the meat of it. But I actually joined Infosys Consulting way back in 2000. Internet was just starting. Infosys was a maintenance company. And when I joined, Infosys, there were just 5,000 people. And when I left it, there were like, I think, several lakhs and lakhs of people in the company. So very fast growth pace. And while I did a number of roles at Infosys, I think the main thing that I learned in Infosys is how do you actually think through a problem and bridge the gap between business and technology? So the problem often becomes that we see ourselves as a tech person or a business person, but the real value isn't when you bridge these two. And I also learned a lot in terms of how do you work with people without necessarily having them report to you, right? Through influence. And, I learned to respect hierarchy, but not be limited by it. So there were times when I would go right up to the top management and say, this is not working, we need to change it. And it was the kind of company where you could do that. In Fidelity, it was actually about, it was a logical step. So I'd spent about 9-10 years in Infosys Consulting. It was a logical step to once you've built a business, to actually move to something which is more domain specific, which was my core in Fidelity. So it was really about understanding the wealth management business in with deep insights and building an analytics center of excellence. And I have to say, analytics has changed so much from that time. We used to do our work in SAS and in Excel. And in fact, when I started my career, I didn't even have an internet on my desk. So the world has changed so much since when I started. And that was my role at Fidelity. But I always had this entrepreneurial bug in me. And so I decided to jump after about 4-5 years into entrepreneurship at New Rubric. It was an ed tech venture. And the idea was that we all have got report cards which say 70 on 100 can do better. and I never knew what I could do better. And so it was really about using analytics collected within the classroom, both in terms of a person's behavior as well as a person's understanding of different topics to help them bridge this gap. And so we developed a patent pending products. And in fact, at the end of it, in 2018, when I decided to exit this business, we sold the patent and the business, right? And I think there, the learning entrepreneurial is a completely different ballgame for those who are planning to become entrepreneurs. It's you do everything and anything. I learned to be a full stack developer when I became an entrepreneur. So I had only coded in college. So you just basically have to be open to learning everything. So it is a great experience. I learned so much about how you learn, actually. So there's actually a course about how you learn, and I learned so much about that, right? I started Set My Test. Actually, I exited Newbrick because my son was born and I wanted to spend more time with him. I started Set My Test as a side venture, but it kind of really took off because of the COVID times, and teachers needed a lot of help. It was about helping teachers manage this entire, no classroom, doing testing during COVID, and it really took off and it's running on its own now. I have a few people still working there. We run it more as not a venture for profit, but as a venture to just help education, folks in education, right? Right now I'm at Scripbox, a lot of exciting things happening at Scripbox. So my career has really been at every stage about learning something new in each of my roles. And that's really what I focused on.
Great. Yeah, that's a very interesting journey. I have a couple of follow-ups there. I think one thing that you touched on initially was about how exactly you can use technical skills to solve business problems. And more now, data is becoming a very important component in approaching and solving business problems. So I just want to get your point of view, your perspective on what it takes to actually go from data, which most companies have lying in various places, various silos, to actually delivering business value and solving business problems with data. What does that process look like?
Yeah. So very interesting question and a very relevant question, because one of the reasons that most data science projects fail is nobody knows what's the business value, right? So I actually have a different philosophy. You need to start from the business problem, right? So I remember the CEO of one of my, calling one of my data scientists and saying, hey, do an attrition or a churn analysis for me, right? And he came back and started doing something. So I've told him, don't do this. Go back and ask, why do you want this attrition analysis, right? So what are you really trying to solve, right? The answer could be that I'm not sure this is a problem. I want to know if it's a problem or not. Or it could be, I need to increase my profits by 30%. And I think there's a lot of leakage. We need to figure out 3 ways to stop that leakage. Very, very different kind of problems. In the first, you're going to see whether your attrition is in level with the market and is it something out of range. On the second, you're going to try and solve a different kind of a problem, right? So really, I think a lot of data scientists, because they tend to come from a tech background, are really reluctant to go and sit in front of a business leader and ask, why do you really want this? And help them define the problem. So typically a business leader is just shooting something. They have some idea in mind, but they're just giving you a one-liner or a two-liner. So I think that's a very, very important skill in trying to use data to solve business problems. Really helping, not being scared, really asking them, why do you want this? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And I'd say that's the first thing. The second thing is what I call, and we've not come to data so far, what I call is structured thinking program. And almost everyone in my team will always go through a training on this, right? There is, by the way, there's a great book called The Mind of the Strategist, which was written by Kenichi Ome, who was a partner in McKinsey in 1970s. And we all still follow that book, which really says, how do you break down a problem? That's it. So you want to do attrition analysis, you first have to understand, okay, if attrition were prevented, how much am I going to save? How do I actually break down this problem? Do I do it by product lines? What is my hypothesis, right? So I think once you have done these two, that's when you get to the data. And then you really know, okay, you got tons, like you said, you got tons and tons of data, right? So you got, you can typically get, 300 user points on a user, but do you need 300 user points? So it's really about selecting which data points you want, how you want to aggregate them and make them into a meaningful model. So I think steps 1, 2, and 3 are really critical before you start, building that model. And so that's what I'd say there.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you there that even before that, at least as data scientists or data professionals, we have a tendency to immediately start downloading some data, exploring with it in Python, pandas or something. But ideally, we should just go and talk and figure out the solution before we even figure out what the problem is before we even begin. Completely agree. So thanks for that perspective. The next question I have is just maybe talking a little bit about your work at Scriptbox and maybe in more general terms. How is data science used in the domain of wealth management, investment, and just finance more generally? Because a lot of people here are very interested in the finance in this domain and want to pursue a career in data science potentially in the domain. But it's not very obvious from the outside what are all the different ways in which it can be used. So any thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. That's one of my most favorite chats with all my colleagues in other companies at similar roles, right? So data science is big in finance and in retail. And there's a reason for it, because it's largely about focusing on each individual customer, right? If I were to talk about finance, right? So money is what, most people think of money as something you earn, but money is really a tool to have freedom in life. And it's so very close to our hearts. We are all very emotional about it. And whether you're doing investing or lending, it's really about using your money wisely, right? So because it's so important, and let me talk about the use case with Scriptbox first, and then I'll extend it to other use cases, right? And because it's so important, we all feel very vulnerable. And I'll give you a business answer to this question before I go to the data science. We all feel quite vulnerable, right? So it's a very technical area, right? So how much money do you need? What product funds to invest in? Should I do small cap, large cap, mutual fund companies, debt funds? What is equity debt ratio? You can just get lost in the jargon and the technicality of it, right? So really, one of the use cases in wealth management where I come from, and which is what Scriptbox really started with, was an algorithmic approach, right? So to how you plan your money and having a non-biased way, what you call a robo-advisor, a complete algorithmic way to research and figure out what funds you should invest in for your different purposes. So I think that was the fundamental first use case that we started with at Scriptbox. Now, as the market deepened, we realized that customers had more needs, right? So first, we all have different. So how you would invest would be very different from me. What your goals would be different from mine. What your confidence, you might be a very confident investor, I might be a highly underconfident investor. You might want to go digital, I might want to talk to someone. There's so many differences. So for example, somebody may say, I'm young, I want to start my company in the next 5 years, so I need to just build a pot for that. Whereas someone may say, hey, I'm very confused, my neighbor is telling me this, so-and-so is telling me this, what should I really do? And so it's about, while we about an algorithmic way to actually figure out where you need to invest, now it was about personalization. So what we did was, and this is the journey we've been in the last 1 year and which we have implemented now, which is we really figured out a lot of different segments based on the data we have about customer behavior, about customer profile, and how they transact with us. And this has really helped us identify who's this customer, right? What do they want? And so enable us to personalize what kind of communication we are giving them, what kind of journey we take them, what kind of products we recommend to them. So they actually are able to achieve their goals better instead of one standard approach, right? So that's the second thing. Now what we are working on is even more exciting. We are trying to take this entire experience to what we call hyper-personalization. And you guys, you might have read about hyper-personalization in different places, but what we are really talking about is segment of one. You are a unique customer to us. And based on what we know about you and what we can infer about you, we will put you on a unique path on our journey. And we will suggest unique funds to you, which really help you achieve the goal and track how you're doing, right? So that's really where the rubber hits the road, because finance is a very personal process, right? If I were to take other examples, right? So other places where in data science is being very actively used in finance, if you take lending, for example, they're doing the same personalization to really figure out what is the credit worthiness of a person, right? So one is having your credit score, but suppose your credit score is not good enough, right? Does that mean you're not worthy of being lent to? Not really, right? So it's about really using other parameters that you can find from your data, from your behavior, which are beyond that credit score, to actually figure out whether you can lend to them. So for example, lending to the lower income section or people who maybe not getting a loan from a bank is a very, very big growing business. Lending tech is one of the biggest growing businesses right now. And data science is what's powering it, right? It's really about figuring out the credit worthiness of that person and continuously improving your model to figure that credit worthiness. Other examples are, for example, in insurance, right? Figuring out what is the risk, reward, what is the pricing I need to give, keeping your pricing very dynamic, right? So for example, Digit's doing such a great job of that. And how do I take that customer through the journey so that at the end of the day, they realize that this is exactly what they need. Insurance is very complex to buy, and how do you help people through that? So these are all things that are happening in finance. And it's all around the concept of actually personalization and hyper-personalization. That's the core that's holding it all together.
Great. So there is one slightly counterintuitive point here that maybe I want to go slightly deeper on, which is a question a lot of people have as well, which is that on the one hand, you're saying that we're getting data about more and more people, potentially millions of people, and then all these different instruments in the market, etc. But on the other hand, we're saying that you want to make it very hyper personal. You want to kind of customize the experience for an individual person. So how exactly do things go from this large amount of data about millions of people to a very personal and refined experience for every single user?
So it's a long journey. You hit the crux of the problem, right? So people are constantly working on it, and that's where the exciting stuff is happening. You start out with saying, okay, let me at least figure out 10 segments, right? And you say, what is driving these 10 segments? So you just build a model for classifying customers into 10 segments and seeing whether by research and by their behavior, you can actually validate that model, which is what we started out with, right? Then you start running small experiments, right? You say, okay, I believe data point. So you start creating aggregate scores. So for example, very, very basic example, you don't look at the city that a person comes from. You do your own classification of cities, maybe tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or maybe your own classification of cities, saying that, say, people from the north behave in a particular way, people from south behave in a particular way, right? So you apply your own some intelligence to create what you call aggregated scores. And then you start running your models on these aggregated scores, and that's where the stats bit of it comes in. You say which is more relevant, which is less relevant. You really need a very good knowledge of statistics to figure out which model is working for you, and it takes some time, 3-6 months, to keep running that model and seeing whether it's getting validated or not. Once you have a valid model, then you scale it up. And so you keep running these small kind of experiments, and sooner or later, right, you start. So we started out with 3 parameters which defined a segment. Now we know there are about 13, 14, and we've dropped a few, right? So you have to really figure out some kind of aggregated scores. If you go with individual data, it's crazy, right? There's just too much of data out there. And the idea is no machine learning model will work well if you say put 100 parameters into it and say, give me the answer. It's just not going to work well. You've got to use few aggregated scores which combine the important elements and then run the model. So what aggregated scores we use for different models also changes. Does that make sense?
I think it absolutely does. And just kind of touching on another aspect of this same question, where exactly does machine learning come into picture in this entire process, and how much because again, this is something that a lot of people have a question about, like, do you start building a model from day one, or do you more do statistical analysis, data analysis, visualization, maybe some insights from that data? When does machine learning come in?
So I think there are 2 things that determine this, right? So one is how mature you are as an organization in terms of data, data science, and how mature is your field, right? So if I were to do a credit scoring today, I would start with the modeling, because that area is relatively well understood. You can start with a model and you can build a model. If on the other hand, I was do something very, very specific, which is for my business, like figuring out why people are churning in my business, I might start a little ahead in the process. So the question to ask yourself is, do I have a hypothesis on which I can build an initial model? Right. If as an organization, as a business, you have a hypothesis on which you can build a model, then you can start with modeling. Typically, in my understanding, other than for very established use cases, people don't start with machine learning models. You typically start with a business analysis, or it might be even as rudimentary as an Excel analysis done over 2 weeks. And then you start doing a statistical modeling on any tool, doesn't matter whether it's Python, just a simple Python code, doesn't need to be a model. And then you convert it to a machine learning model, because then you can actually push it into your live production environment. Till then, you're still learning.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I think it kind of ties back to your point about focusing on the business problem. Like as a data scientist or a data professional, your focus is to solve that problem in whatever capacity through whatever tools you have, and then bring in machine learning at the right point as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about your experience as a data science leader for a lot of people here who are very new to the domain and are taking their first initial steps into the data science career. Can you tell us a little bit about what are different profiles in this domain and what are like some of the skills or abilities associated with some of these profiles?
Sure. So you'll hear a lot of different terminologies and a lot of different names, but primarily there are 3 kinds of roles in a data science team, right? So first is who I consider the most foundational and critical resource, which is the data engineer. Okay, so I was actually talking to a VC in the US. He says, data science might get automated, but data engineering is never going to. And that's because it's the plumbing of the team. And so if you think of it as a house, it doesn't matter how beautiful walls or coloring you do. If the plumbing isn't there, nobody's going to come and live in that house, right? So the idea of a data engineer is they actually build the pipelines to correctly get the data from different sources. So for example, you'll have a transaction source. You'll get the data from there. You'll have somewhere where you store the profile information of the customer. You'll get there. Somewhere you'll have all your clickstream analysis. You summarize that and you get there. So you'll have external data. So for example, in financial services, something called an account aggregator, which gives you all the accounts of a customer once they give you permission. You might get some data on the LinkedIn profile of the person, if the person has permitted you to do so, right? So they actually are very strong in data management, data warehousing, understand data pipelines and the tools for that very well. And in my opinion, this job is never going away. This job is without this person being there, there's no point having a data scientist, because this is the base of this. So that's who a data engineer is. And I've seen enough people start as a data engineer and go into a data analyst. But I also insist that a data analyst sit next to a data engineer, because I think it brings an understanding into how difficult it is to get the right data organized for you. And also it gives you an understanding of how accurate or how reliable is your data. The second role, which I'd say, is what's sometimes called a domain analyst, sometimes called a data analyst, but essentially this is a person who understands the domain and the customers, right? So he or she will work with the business owner or whoever's the business partner to create the hypothesis. We'll do the initial statistic analysis of data to say, okay, just based on the data that I have, some sample data, I can prove or disprove. We'll make visualizations, communicate, this is the learning on why customers are churning, for example, or how customers are growing, for example, to the management team, etc. So they are really the starting point from which a data scientist kind of takes us. So this is called a data or a domain analyst. And these people typically can come from different roles, like can come from that domain, can come from a product management, can come from, business analyst, different roles. But you typically look for someone who understands the business, right? So you need to understand that particular domain. The third is a really cool job, which most people classify as a cool job, which is the data scientist. So what the data scientist does is takes the learning and the hypothesis, which have been proven by the data or domain analyst, and really builds a model, either primarily for 2 things, though it can be for other things, either for understanding causation, what's causing this, or for understanding prediction, right? So if, for example, I'm going back to the churn analysis because that's a very common example which most companies do. So there has been some hypothesis created, like, young people churn. very, very basic hypothesis. I'm just taking it as a very rudimentary example. The data scientist will actually create a model then to predict what is the likelihood of a person churning or not churning. And this could also be a mission. I'm also classifying, machine learning engineers in this, and then work to actually stabilize and build that model so that it can actually be moved into production. So get the accuracy level to whatever you have defined, the accuracy and the predictability level, right? Then finally, you have the ML ops person, who might be a separate person, or your DevOps person who will actually move this model into production. So these are the roles that are there typically in a data science team.
Great. Thanks. I think that covers kind of the entire spectrum. And one question a lot of people have about the various roles is, how rigid are some of these paths, or do people switch? I think you touched on that a little bit, but how rigid or how easy is it to switch between these roles for somebody who's interested in data and is just starting out?
Yeah. So I, as a person who's done so many different roles, and I think this is true for almost everybody who heads up data science, they would have done different things because data science as a discipline has only been around for 8 to 10 years, right? I think it's completely possible for people to move from one role to another, but it's not easy. And when I say it's not easy, what I mean is it will take a lot of initiative of the person to build the skills for the next level. So for example, if say you join as a data engineer and you want to become a data analyst, you really need to learn the tools of a data analyst, and you need to be willing to put yourself out there. Or you're a data analyst who wants to become a data scientist, let's say. You really need to you need to build your own models on your spare time, show that you can actually do that. So it's not I don't think anything is hard and fast. This is like a little bit like front-end engineer and back-end engineer, etc. Does this mean a front-end engineer can never become a back-end? No, we have full-stack engineers, right? But you need to put in the effort to do that, right? And so I think it depends on two things. It depends on your organization and the willingness of the organization to invest. And I think most organizations are willing to invest because finding the people in these roles is really, really difficult. So if someone is ready to learn, they'll be the most happiest to invest. And second is, how much effort are you willing to put outside of your day-to-day job to actually make this move?
Got it. So switching is possible, but it definitely takes a lot of initiative and effort on your part as well. Makes sense. Okay. One other thing I want to maybe get your thoughts on, since over the years as a data leader, you've probably interviewed hundreds of people and built out these teams. For somebody who's just starting out in the domain, what areas should they focus on, or how exactly can they come best prepared for the interviews that they're going to have for data science roles?
Yeah. I'm actually, again, going to give a slightly different answer from the usual. There are skills and qualities that you need to build, which are both technical and non-technical, right? But I think the first and foremost thing that any company looks at, which most people don't do a good job of, or I say many people don't do a good job of, is showing to the hiring manager that you really want this job. Okay, so people tend to focus a lot on, okay, I did technical skills. I'll make a big list of all the Python stuff that I've done, all the libraries I've used, or I'll make a list of all the projects, all the courses I've done, all important. But read the JD, know about the company, and have an idea of why you want to do that job. So hiring managers also don't want to keep on looking for the ideal person. Ideally, they would like to do 2 interviews, select one person and go if they can find the good candidate, right? Hiring is an addition to your main job. But finding that this is the first and I think most important criteria, that know what the job is about, read the JD, understand it. And I don't think many people do a good job, right? And you need to make a pitch about why you are right for the role. The second thing is obviously, I wouldn't say, some people test for technical capability, but if companies are giving you a project to do, they're not only checking for technical capability, but they're also seeing how much effort are you willing to put, right? So I look for what I call technical familiarity. So I don't ask the person to walk through a Python code, for example, or whatever. It's been different languages at different points in time. But more importantly, I'll show him some Python code that I have written or somebody in my team has written and say, what's wrong with this? So that requires a certain technical familiarity and a certain comfort with that language to be actually able to say that. And you need that base to actually learn and build, because that base is something most companies would expect that you learn and you come to the job market. The third thing I look at is what is called structured thinking, and which is I give a problem. So I give a piece of, like, I give a bunch of data, right? So I say, this is our whatever revenue and cost numbers for the last 8 months. Okay, what's the problem that you see here, right? So the person, some people don't even see a problem, which is itself a problem, because you're going to work as a data scientist. You need to see the problems which are happening right in front of you. But many people do see the problem. Then the question is, okay, so what data would you look for now to actually dig deeper into this problem? And there we are not looking for right answers or wrong answers. And this is like a case kind of a interview. You're basically looking at, can this person think through a problem? Can this person ask questions and get to the data? So I'd say these are the three main things you look. You look for technical familiarity, you look at this person really want to do the job, and you look for some structured thinking. And there will be other things that specific to the role that might come up. But these three, I would say that almost every hiring manager in this area looks at.
Got it. Got it. So one follow-up I have there, a lot of people have some difficulty, at least with some of the open-ended case study kind of problems. And I think some of this comes from just the interview preparation process. Often we end up just looking at maybe a lot of questions where the question is given and there's a certain answer, whether it's multiple choice or like sort of a clear step-by-step answer. So can you share some thoughts on how to approach a case study, kind of an open-ended problem in an interview?
Okay, sure. So the first thing I'd say is don't freeze. So some people are, I think because of people see case study as tough mentally, I think many people just freeze. And I've heard people say, I can't do this. Give it your attempt, right? That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, if you go out there are today great courses on how you go about solving a case. Okay, so an issue tree, for example, is a great structure, right? In which you can break down. So if I were to take this, what is wrong? Okay, my revenue has dipped in 2 months, and then it has not gone up to the original amount, right? Then you break down what are the components of revenue, right? What is there in the revenue? Okay, how many are some customers responsible for this revenue? So you just need to learn how to think calmly and logically. Like, what's the next question? But for those of you who want to attempt to do this, I think this is the way Google, almost every, Amazon, everybody interviews, right? So there are lots and lots of ways online where you can crack this and you can learn how to tackle a case study interview. But my biggest thing was don't freeze. And just think, even if you don't know it, think common sense. That's what it is.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, I think common sense, just thinking of it in sort of a structured step-by-step fashion is something, and not trying to jump to some kind of a technical answer. I think that's a very useful way to look at it. Great. Thanks. So those are more or less all the questions that I had, and we can maybe take a few questions from the audience as well. But maybe I just want to get like any general advice that you would have in mind for freshers, for people exploring the domain or just starting with the domain. What is the few things they should keep in mind in general?
Sure. First, I have to say I have hired a few people who've gone through Jovian, and I found them to be tremendously good.
Great. I'm happy to hear that.
I'm very glad to be here today. I think one thing I would tell young people is don't jump for money, jump for role or growth. Because your initial years is when you're actually adding value, right? And try to learn as much as you can from the role. So don't limit it like, okay, I am so-and-so, this is my start, this is my end, right? Try and learn, go and talk to people in your organization, learn as much as you can about that business. That's what really builds your career as you go further and further. I mean, somebody brought about the point about ChatGPT, right? So I think in the next 3 years, all our jobs are going to be totally different. And when I say all, I'm being very broad, but yeah, many jobs are going to be totally different. Goldman Sachs predicts that 300 million full-time jobs are going to be completely different, right? So it's going to affect all of us. And the only constant is that there is a change. So learning as much as you can in each role, particularly at the start of your career, when you have much more energy and flexibility, is really, really important. So don't limit your role that this is what I will do. I am not meant to do this. And allied with that, I would say, is speak up, right? I find a lot of young people being underconfident, again, being limited by the role, and know that in most organizations, people like people who speak up. But obviously, you have to speak sense. But if you speak and say, you know what, you're saying this, but hey, I have a contrary view to this because of ABC, I think people like it. And these two things really build your career in any organization, because it's not just the role you are in, it's also how much you're contributing with others.
Got it. Yeah, I think both of those points are really insightful, actually, and something that people can actually start applying very easily. It doesn't even require you to like go ahead and go out and learn something. It's just a change in mindset, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The change in mindset, sorry, just the change in the mindset is the toughest. And it's easiest to do when you start your career. As you go older and older, as my boss likes to tell me, you don't change. So
makes sense.
Yeah, so it's best if you set all that right when you're young.
Okay. So one other thing that you also touched on and seems to be a popular question in the chat as well. What are your thoughts on ChatGPT, language models, generative AI, and how that is going to affect things in general, but also the data science landscape in particular?
No, that's $1 million question. If I knew, I would start a company tomorrow and just do that, right? But not to be trivial, this is exactly what I've been discussing. So I've been to a conference every day in the last 15 days and only to discuss ChatGPT, right? So I asked a VC, one of the partners from Axel, how do you think this is going to happen, right? And he said, it's evolving, even we are looking at it, right? So I was asking Microsoft, they also tell me that it's evolving, right? So I think a couple of things are happening with ChatGPT. I think language learning models are a tremendous step ahead because there are so many business applications that can happen. They do have their limitations, but I think those limitations, there's enough money being put in to overcome those limitations in the next year or year and a half, right? So I see ChatGPT being used for everything, right? So for example, so forget even putting in front of customers, helping your frontline people, right, talk to customers differently, right? So a customer wants to know which 3 small cap funds are the best and why. The advisor doesn't need to keep it in his head. It comes very beautiful answer comes to him, which he can then deliver to the customer, right? And over a period of time, it will get directly delivered to the customer, some of that stuff, right? So I think the biggest thing that anybody who's in the space right now can do is experiment. And there are already a lot of experiments and plugins, and every day I'm seeing something. So right now there is something which you can just create a landing page, right? So you just say, you give it a 3-line instruction. This is my business, this is whatever. It'll create a beautiful landing page with images and everything, right? So all of this is going to become better and better. So it's important that it'll be great if you're not using ChatGPT now, you should use ChatGPT. For those of you who can, that license and signing up for the API is great. I assume there are a lot of developers on this call. Build your own small POC with ChatGPT, right? It's not too difficult and you'll learn a lot and it will be extremely valuable. But it's going to come, I believe it's going to revolutionize how we work in the next 3 years.
Yeah, great. I think I completely agree. And it's a great insight that the immediate use case is some of the experiments that you can do and maybe improve your own efficiency and help the customer experience. The example that you gave makes a lot of sense. And it also explains how we've been using ChatGPT internally, where although we have started integrating it as well, but right now it's just how can we deliver good stuff faster to our customers. And I think that's sort of the immediate use case, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And there's one related question here, which is, do you think SQL will be relevant 5 years down the line, or will it all shift to natural language? What are your thoughts there, at least looking at the current trajectory of things?
See, LLMs are basically only for text, right? They do well with text. I think there will still be a large amount of data which will be structured, okay? Whether it's in SQL or no SQL, right? And that really depends on the scalability and the application. And I think there are clear use cases where you would use one. But still, when people NoSQL came, people said, is SQL dying? But it didn't, right? There is a use case for that. So I think, it's difficult to predict, but I don't think SQL is going away in a hurry.
Right.
In fact, I see SQL queries being merged with, LLM kind of models to do something. So let me give you an example, right? So a customer comes and asks you, the market's very shaky. Should I stop investing this month? Right? You need both the structured data of how much the customer has been investing, what is his returns, blah, blah, blah. And you need the unstructured data from your research to be able to answer a question like that. Now, we are a little farther away from that. That's going to take a few years to come to. But that requires both SQL and so I don't think it's going away now.
Makes sense. Okay, there is a couple of interesting questions here, more general. One is, any tips on time management, how to stay on top of work and make sure everything is done while also learning new things? Because I think for us as professionals, that's sort of one of the core meta skills that a lot of people struggle with.
It's really tough. I wish I could learn that too better. It's really tough, and it just gets tougher and tougher as you get more and more responsibility, right? So one thing which I have learned, which actually Mr. Narayan Murthy told us in one of our meetings, is that eat your frog first. And I think there have been books about it, right? So do your most important and the task that you're dreading first thing in the morning, right? And they will be, there are nice matrices which tell you which is urgent, which is this, all great to use. If you are a very structured person, you can use them really well. But I would say that the one tip that I have is eat your frog first. Do the toughest thing, which you are not looking forward to do, whether it's a call or an email or a presentation or thinking about something in the morning. Also recognize whether you're a morning person or a night person and do your thinking accordingly. So some people are morning people, you do great thinking. Some people are night people and you do great thinking at that time, and try and do your thinking at that time. That's what I would say. If anybody has better tips, I'm happy to take them.
Those again are slightly non-conventional, but also very interesting tips in the sense that the eat your frog is a great example of something that all of us can really apply very quickly to our lives. So thanks for that. Okay, there's also another question here about book recommendations. So maybe I'll just expand on that a little bit. Maybe like 3 book recommendations on the technical side, around related to data or related to just in general, career in general, and maybe 3 non-technical books or even like more general career related books, anything that you would like to share.
Okay, I'm going to try and pull up the names. I read a lot of books. So I will digest. So I exhaust my education allowance on books. So that's what happens, right? But I'm going to try and pick out, it's a little tough. Like I already mentioned, so I'm going to start with non-technical and technical books. So the non-technical books, I have one recommendation, which I already gave, is The Mind of the Strategist. It's written by this gentleman named Kenichi Ome. He was a McKinsey partner, and it till today, like it was written in the 70s, and it's been revised a couple of times, but till today, it's the Bible of how you do structured thinking. So you had a question, how do I prepare for case interviews? If you really want to invest time and prepare for them, that's a great book to read. Okay. The other book there is another great book, which I think is about more understanding yourself and how you can change your own habits, which is called The Power of the Habit. I found it to be personally very helpful, right? So I'd say these 2 books. But let's come more technical. I tend to rely on a lot of blogs and stuff like that for technical stuff, right? I love courses which have been done by great teachers, and I've identified certain teachers who I love, and I just go and do their course, whether I like it or whether it's directly relevant to me or not relevant to me. But I'm just trying to pull out. So there's a book called for data visualizations called Charts, Good Charts, I think. And I fortunately don't remember the exact name, but I can share it with you, and you can maybe share it with folks after this. And there is a course by, again, I'll share the courses with you. I'm not able to recall them offhand, but I will do that. I'll share the specific names and the links.
Sure, absolutely. Great. Thanks for the recommendations. Thank you. I think we've come up on the hour almost already. Wow. Yeah. I didn't even realize how quickly the hour passed by, but thanks a lot. It was great hosting you. And I think we covered a wide range of topics. And if I'd love to know in the chat how people felt about the session and how you enjoyed. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we hope to maybe host you once again sometime.
Thank you. My pleasure. Great to talk to everyone.
Great. Thanks, Krithika.
Okay.